Welcome to the third episode of Teacher Perceptions and Experiences with Evaluation Systems. On today's episode, Ideas of Implementation from Inside the Classroom, we will hear from teachers from different backgrounds, states, and experiences. These teachers will have an open discussion on their ideas on how to improve the implementation of teacher evaluation policy. So, who would like to start us off?
I'll go. So this is Molly. I taught high school in Colorado, and Colorado is one of the few / only state actually that requires 50% of teacher evaluations to come from student data. So it's a very unique situation, although most states do have a significant requirement in terms of the portion of teacher evaluations that need to come from student data. What I would say based on my experience is that as a teacher, knowledge that 50% of what I was doing was going to come from these scores essentially meant that I wrote that 50% off, as most teachers did. And we focused on the 50% that we felt like we could actually control. And Colorado recently launched a pilot program to revise their previous evaluation system that I was under because of problems of implementation. So the prior rubric was so long that it had like 300 elements that you had to self-evaluate on, and then administrators had to evaluate you on, and it took so long that it became meaningless. So this new version is kind of parsed down to a much smaller, more succinct version in order to make conversations more meaningful. And I certainly hope that that is the effect, because in my experience, none of my evaluative conversations with administrators was anything more than perfunctory. So hopefully shortening the length and making it a very clear, kind of straightforward set of things will make more productive conversations.
Yeah, those are great ideas.
I feel like this is Taylor, taught in South Carolina, taught elementary school. I've been thinking a lot about what I would do to fix this, and it seems really complicated to me to think about how to fix some big evaluation issues. And I also feel like a lot of the solutions I brainstorm are competing solutions in some ways. So for example, I keep thinking about bias with observations specifically that go into evaluations. I've had friends who have the observers come from outside of the school, so that it takes away the administrator bias that you have. But then I also recognize that's not a reality for a lot of schools, to be able to have the manpower or the money, to bring people in. And then my competing idea is that I also feel like part of a problem with observations used as evaluations is you have principals or observers that come in so infrequently that it's hard to for them to really evaluate what your classroom is like and how you are as a teacher by just a few visits. And so when I think about it on that end, then I think, well, wouldn't it be nice if these evaluators were a frequent presence in the classroom, and so that they could have a more holistic vision. So that's tough, because those are two different things. On one thing I'm telling you, take away the bias, get people who are outside of the system. And then on the other hand, I'm no, bring the people in the system in every week. So it's hard, because there's not a magic bullet I can really think of.
I'm with you on that. This is Courtney. And Taylor, I've thought about this question a lot also. I'm an instructional coach just for 1 year. And so not only have I been evaluated under Tennessee's team evaluation, but I'm not an evaluator now, but I help teachers do well on the evaluation. So we look at that very closely. And I think I like I don't know, it's such a tough question, but I think that it is evolving and getting better. I'll say that. I've seen that through education. And I'm kind of thinking about, I love the self-evaluation model. I love the fact that a teacher could come in, appear, and evaluate, that the students could evaluate. If we really want to improve teaching rather than just put a mark on a teacher's forehead, a number, then we could do that in a much smarter way. And instead of just having them come in once where you're putting on a show for example, like dog and pony kind of situation, that's not really conducive to improving anybody's situation. And so if we want to make it stronger, then we have to make it broader. But like to your point, Molly, then that starts taking forever and too time consuming, and you don't have the manpower to do it. So I'm not sure what the answer is either, but I think that as a teacher for myself, if I knew that it was sort of the open door policy and I had people in there all the time giving me valuable feedback, that it would be an adjustment, it would be a switch, but it would be helpful if that culture was to change, where you just, like, as we do to our students. I mean, the students come in every day and we evaluate them and we give them feedback, and they have to give each other feedback and constructive criticism, and then we as adults don't often subject ourselves to that kind of scrutiny, and when we do, it's terrifying and we're nervous and have all those same reactions that the students are desensitized to, you know.
Yeah, that's very true. I hadn't thought about it that way, of we're putting all this pressure on students and evaluating them, but then we don't like the pressure ourselves, so we shouldn't be putting this on students when we don't like and we're not willing to have that put on us as teachers. And something that Alana shared in one of the other episodes is that at her school, it's a charter school, they have evaluators in there every single week, that you are evaluated once every week, and she really enjoys that, and you get scores every week, and if you get below a certain score, then they'll come more than once a week. And so it's cool to see that it's a smaller school, but they have the manpower, they can be in there every week, so it does provide that consistency, and they do have the resources in order to do that.
I think that also speaks to a point that you made, Courtney, about culture and how important the culture is surrounding an evaluation. So at like a school that's a charter school, they can kind of reinvent that culture so that it's framed more positively, that it is just about improving and doing what's best for kids. Whereas I feel like in my experience in a traditional public school with the state model system, it was very much like live or die, you know, the way that it's super high stakes, and it's not about improving. It's like they're going to give you a score, and that score is going to determine whether or not you can be fired. Yeah. So it doesn't really facilitate a situation in which people are open to being vulnerable and to saying, this is what I want to improve on and this is what I want to work for. And it also kind of, in that same vein, that teachers aren't really in the mindset to kind of be open and have that, principals and administrators aren't necessarily in the position likewise to provide that. Especially when you consider the fact that most principal evaluations actually take into account how many teachers they have that are rated highly, which they themselves do. Yeah. So it's a very interesting kind of circle that I don't think should exist.
I think also, this is Caroline, I taught first grade in Oklahoma City. Evaluations need to be varied based on what grade you're teaching to. So like I taught first grade, we didn't have test scores, so that was never a conversation I had. But things like behavior, social emotional skills, like fine motor skills, those are things my kids needed to know. But like the only thing I was ever graded on what my lesson plans looked like and what the 20 minutes a person saw when they came in for 2 times in the entire year. So I think like having a more umbrella observation, where maybe like you include parents and ask them how like that conversation's been between them and the teacher, include like peer observations. Like I think it needs to be a more holistic look, kind of like what Taylor was talking about, because I think without that, you're seeing such a snapshot of something. And I mean, I had situations where someone would come in and that was the moment I could decide to melt down. And like I had a system in place to address it, but they didn't know that because they never took the time to ask, and you're just watching a kid melt down. It's like, well, if you ask me like what I'm doing, I am doing things, you just may not realize that's what I'm doing while I'm also facilitating an entire class and trying to make everyone move forward in a certain direction. So I think like conversations beforehand are really important, and I think a holistic approach would be better. But I also agree, like funding, time, like all those giant things we always talk about as issues will still be issues.
Do you think a holistic approach would work for all grade levels? Because I know you said that the rubric needs to look different depending on the grade, but do you think that the holistic approach needs to be there for elementary and secondary?
I mean, I think I would love to see that. I think it's a lot harder the older you get with students, but I think it would be great. I think it would also, you would have to change it though. Like I think like obviously like skills that are important in certain grades are not important. Hopefully they will have learned them by then and advanced out of them. So I think like changing it based on the grade you're in, but I think just taking a holistic approach not only is like best for the teacher, but is really best for the student, because like their teacher is then being evaluated not just in like one moment in time, but as like what they're doing as a profession, as a professional human being.
I want to add to that, because I work at an art school, and the fine art teachers have not only the team evaluation, but they have a portfolio model that they prepare all year, and they have to have evidence of student growth. They have to have student critique in there. They have to have, there are all these different elements and evidence of their teaching, and it feels like a more holistic approach. But I'll tell you that even with that, they are stressed about it all year. They worry about it all year. They have to remember to provide documentation of that all year. They have PLCs where they're helping each other build that portfolio, and they don't have extra time to pull all of that together. And so I think that sounds like a better model, but there you go. Again, if you're going to provide teachers extra opportunities for growth, you have to provide them extra time to do that within. And another point that my husband often brings up, he's in education as well, is that no one can see your scores. I mean, I can see my scores, and my my administration can see my scores, but general public can't. No. It's not like something you can search. So even though it feels high stakes, and as teachers, for me, I'm really conscious of that. I definitely want to be an A+ kind of girl at all times, and it bothers me when I'm not, and I have, all this rationale for it. The reality is that's all between me and the administrator always. And I've even seen people that have not been at the top of the evaluation, they are not 5s, or that's how the number in Tennessee is. They still get jobs. Administrators still hire them with that knowledge, because they come with recommendations, for example, or they come with particular experience. In Nashville, we're facing a teacher shortage majorly, so even if you have one little scar on your evaluation or two, you're probably still going to be okay. So even though teachers beat themselves up, it's not published in the newspaper. You can't find it on the internet. And so, there's that also. I don't know whether that's good or bad. I would like to keep that private.
I don't want to read the newspaper and see it. Yeah, and I think when I reflect back on my experience with our evaluation system, which was similar to how Tennessee's is, I think a big issue with stressing over your score came because we got payouts at my school based on our evaluation scores. Wow. We were a TAP school. And so it ended up being anywhere from a couple $100 to a couple $1,000. Wow. Yeah. And so I try and think about, okay, if I were taken into more of a Tennessee context where I'm going through the same rubric process, same thing with student scores, all of this, but there's no payout at the end, would I be as stressed about this? I think in some ways I would, because that's also a personality type to just want to be the best. Right. But I think at my school, I saw a lot of negativity with teachers realizing that it wasn't just an arbitrary number. This was going to be something that could make the difference between paying off your car or, and especially with our school, part of the issue too is it all comes from the same pot of money. And so, if one teacher does really well and a bunch do badly, then that teacher gets more money. So it's there's all these nuances to it that I think when you start throwing in bonuses, that it can become really tricky.
I bet.
Yeah.
Because what about, so before I was talking about in the previous podcast about an administrator who favored the football and basketball coaches at our school, and that was really evident in all his mannerisms and dealings, and I'm sure, and I know these guys and their PowerPoint sit and get kind of teachers, but I'm sure that was not reflected in their evaluation based on their social status in our community and that, so,
Yeah, so much bias comes into play, I feel with evaluations, with principals. And I think that's also a human nature to have bias, which I think is a struggle in and of itself within the evaluation system. But going back to the pay thing, do you think that, and anyone can answer this question, do you think that incentivizing teachers with their evaluation scores through money is an effective model of doing that? Or do you think that's something that should not be permitted anywhere because of any reason.
I mean, I can speak to the opposite point. So we had no money for our evaluations, and nobody cared because there was a huge teacher shortage when I taught. Like, we started and had 230 open positions at the start of the year, like across the district.
Wow.
Yeah, it was huge. Like, you literally could get emergency certified, just walk up with a college degree, and you could teach. So nobody cared what they got because they knew they had their job, and nobody cared to do better because if you wanted to move to a different school, there's 5 openings there too. So someone's gonna hire you. So it was interesting because it was like this thing that like I knew was happening, and like I said, like similar to what Taylor was talking about. Like personally, I was really like alarmed by it and like very on top of it. But most people in my school, like the general culture was, oh, like whatever, like they're popping in today. And the other interesting thing is because it was such a culture like that, like it was supposed to be a surprise observation, and they would just blatantly tell you like it's going to be at 2:30 today, like just wait for it, or like make sure your kids are like doing something. And I'm like, shouldn't they always be doing something? Like, is this not the precedent we're setting? So I think it's interesting to hear the other side of that because like ours was essentially meant nothing. Like you still had your job, you would never lose that job because they couldn't fill it. So it was kind of this like, it meant nothing, and so it like didn't help nor like hurt anything. It was like this arbitrary like checkbox thing that our principal had to do.
That's really interesting. So this is probably not answering your question either, but so my circumstance was different than the two. So we're talking about like getting money or not getting money, and whether or not that incentivizes teachers. But in Colorado, so I think most states usually, someone can correct me if I'm wrong, had like 3 years you can get off probationary status. Colorado changed theirs so that being non-probationary is not a state you can just have. If you have 2 consecutive years of being rated below effective on your teacher evaluations, you revert back to probationary status, which means that you can be fired. So there's no monetary aspect whatsoever, but it still actually affects your ability to be employed and have and maintain job security. And, you know, there is actually also a teacher shortage in Colorado, but we still felt that. And maybe it's because I taught in a school with incredibly high turnover, just as is somewhat unfortunately standard in low-income communities. But it definitely made it more high stakes, which is kind of like that in between kind of your two things. But I would actually argue that I don't know that that's a great idea.
I was going to say, well, do you think that that was a positive thing? Because I think on one hand, and maybe this is the theory behind it, is that, oh, if we're going to incentivize them to do better by like essentially threatening their job, then the teachers are going to perform better, and we're going to have more higher performing teachers. But then on the other hand, is that really the culture that you want to have amongst your teachers? So do you feel like that actually worked, or do you think that made things worse?
I think it made things worse because, and we were talking about this earlier, the subjectivity of evaluations ended up essentially meaning that if your evaluator or the administration liked you, then your job was safe because it directly translated. And if the administration didn't like you, your job wasn't. And I don't think that's okay. And I forget who said this or at what point we were talking about how we can get rid of this like subjectivity and this bias. But I remember the Met Institute's project. My favorite like model of theirs that they suggested was kind of dividing it into thirds. A third is a culture survey for students. A third is test scores because everybody values them. And, you know, we could have a whole other podcast on why I think standardized testing is terrible, but, you know, we'll just leave that as it is. And then having the other third be observations, but have those observations be by multiple different people on multiple different occasions and include peer-to-peer evaluations, as well as potentially even an outsider if those resources are available.
Yeah, and Caroline, I know this would not, like thinking about like student culture, taking up such a big chunk would maybe be more difficult, like student responses for like your age level. But I mean, I just think about how much of a difference that would have made in my school and like school climate if teachers knew that making sure their students felt safe and you know what I mean? Like, I mean, I think just how it would shift a teaching mindset rather than thinking, you know, at my school, like 60% of this evaluation is going to come from these test scores, and then the other 40 is going to be on this, one principle, basically,
So I can play devil's advocate for
Do
just
it.
a second on that, because kids are fickle, and so
I know.
one day if you forget to give them a fist bump on the way in, then they're pretty sure you hate them, and that day they're gonna make sure you know it.
Or if you have
Yeah.
a pretty
100%.
strict teaching style,
Right.
you might have a teacher that's really, fun and friendly, but they're like a pretty crappy teacher,
Right. Right.
I know.
See, I think that that's like a psychometric issue, because I also thinking about that, I was a very strict teacher, and I know plenty of teachers who were not, and were like good friends with the students. But if you specifically ask questions in a way that is not about whether or not your teacher likes you or you like your teacher, but of like, does your teacher consistently hold you to high expectations, and word that however it may appear. Like, do you think your teacher believes that you can be successful?
Yeah.
Like, does your teacher believe in you? Like, things like that. I think that there is a way to phrase them where you can not eliminate what you're saying, but minimize its impact and still have it on the whole be valuable. It is more difficult, definitely, to like come up with how you can kind of trick kids into giving what actually is true,
Yeah.
as opposed to like, well, she gave me lunch detention because I was talking today, so I hate her, kind of
Right.
response. So I think it's definitely a struggle, but I think that it could and should have a role.
And I think too, like, it's no different than your principal being biased, right? So like, you're gonna get that bias regardless of what direction you're coming in potentially. So like, whether that be from a kid or from an adult, like, I think like whoever's reading it or yourself that's reading it, you have to know like there is bias there. Like, whoever's doing it is another human and they're judging you. So like, they are going to judge you in the way they see you, and like that's something you just have to be okay with, because like that's always going to be there.
And I think that we have to think about what is the purpose behind the evaluation system in the first place. Is it to stamp? Is it to mark? Is it to help grow? Is it to give teachers feedback? Like, once you establish the purpose, then you can design it to meet that purpose. And I don't necessarily think, in my experience, that has been clearly defined. And had it been so, it would have given more purpose to the whole process. And so I know what it's for me, and I've seen the way my principal uses it, but that is not a general understanding at every school and every classroom. So there's that part.
great point.
Well, yeah. And I think that's the underlying issue in all of education, whether this is evaluation systems, whether it's test scores, whether it's anything. And we've talked about it so much in our program as, how are you defining education? How are you defining a good education? How are you defining what good teaching is? And having those common goals, and then building a rubric or building a curriculum around that. Is education purely based on academic achievement, or is it based on being good citizens, or so many things like that. That's such a good point, that we need to have a common goal in whatever we're doing in education, and then build from there, not make a bunch of different sporadic goals.
I think your point's also interesting, because I've read the statute that is behind the way evaluations are in the state of Colorado, and like, I would say it's actually voiced in there, and again, who knows for other states what the goals are, but the goals are all of those things, which is the problem, because then it's like, that sounds great, but when you do it in implementation, it's like you can't have all of those goals, because they contradict one another and make it impossible to implement that with fidelity. And I think then, just from that policy standpoint, when you look at it, it's like, well, no wonder you're having implementation policies, because the policy itself was written in a way that's impossible to achieve. So going back to your very original question, like way in the beginning, for like what kind of matters to policymakers, I think actually being realistic instead of idealistic about what evaluation systems can and should do, and maybe it is, just picking one goal. Like, is it that you want it to be used to help teachers improve, or do you want it to be like a pure, like, how good is this teacher? Because it can't really be both.
That's very true. And I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that a lot of the theories, it's good in theory, but in practicality, it's not going to work out. And I think there's a huge disconnect between policymakers and the classroom, because a lot of them have never been in the classroom. And so that's why I think things like this are important for teachers' voices to be heard, and for policymakers and administrators, and as it goes on up, for them to hear the voice from inside the classroom, to be able to fix the implementation and to fix the policy so that the implementation can run smoothly and be successful in the schools. But thank you all for sharing your thoughts and for bringing your ideas from your experiences. To the listeners, I hope that this was enlightening to you all to hear from passionate teachers to speak about their experiences and the ideas that they have to improve the implementation of teacher evaluations in our schools.